That son of a bee got me twice, once when he killed my daughter, and the other time when I didn't get the opportunity to look him in the eye." John Isaacson spoke one of those sentences. There are sentences that a person carries for the rest of their life. Sentences that do not fade with time, that do not soften with age, that sit lodged in the chest the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river, cold, permanent, unmoved by anything that flows above it. That is where this story ends. But to understand what those words truly mean, to feel the full weight of every syllable, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a warm June morning in the desert city of Las Vegas, Nevada. Back to a 14-year-old girl named Stephanie Isaacson, who packed her school bag before sunrise, stepped out into the still morning air, and walked toward a future she would never reach. Everything that follows, the decades of silence, the science that came too late to deliver justice, the ordinary man who refused to let a child be forgotten, all of it leads back to that morning, and all of it leads back to that sentence. Las Vegas is a city of contrasts that most people never fully reckon with. The Strip glitters and roars with neon light and manufactured excitement. But drive a few miles in any direction, and the city gives way to something else entirely. Miles of open desert, flat and silent, the kind of landscape that swallows sound and holds secrets without effort. A city built on the promise of luck, ringed on all sides by a darkness that asks no questions. On the morning of June 1st, 1989, somewhere inside that surrounding darkness, something was waiting. Stephanie Isaacson was 14 years old. She was the daughter of John Isaacson, a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force, a man whose career demanded constant movement, constant adaptation, constant uprooting from one city and one life to begin another. Military families know this rhythm well. It is not easy. It asks something of every member of the household, and it asks something particularly difficult of the children, who must repeatedly walk into unfamiliar schools, unfamiliar neighborhoods, unfamiliar social hierarchies, and somehow find their footing. Most children struggle under that weight. Some never fully find their stride. Stephanie did the opposite. Every new city was a new opportunity. Every new school was a room she eventually made her own. She did not wait for people to come to her. She walked in, introduced herself, and built something real. Former classmates and teachers would later describe her the same way, across different cities, different schools, different chapters of her young life. She was warm, she was genuine, and she made people feel as though they mattered to her because they did. But through every move, through every new beginning, there was one constant that never changed. One relationship that served as the anchor of her world. Her father, John Isaacson, and his daughter did not simply share a house. They shared a life in the fullest sense of that word. On weekends, they rode horses together. On open roads, they rode motorcycles side by side, the desert wind loud around them. They went camping, hunting, boating. They explored the land around them the way people explore it when they genuinely love being alive. And at Lake Mead, in the clear blue water that sits quietly between Nevada and Arizona, the two of them went beneath the surface together and earned their scuba diving certification side by side. A staff sergeant and his teenage daughter, exploring a world most people never bother to see. When John and Stephanie's mother, Sharon, separated, there was no prolonged negotiation about where the children would go. Stephanie made her choice clearly, without hesitation. She would go with her father. Her younger sister, Joanne, who was just 5 years old at the time, stayed with their mother. But Stephanie refused to let geography become a wall between them. She protected that relationship with the kind of fierce, quiet determination that defined her character. Every Wednesday belonged to both girls. Every weekend, every holiday. The distance was real, but the bond was stronger. There is a small story from that period that tells you everything you need to know about who Stephanie Isaacson was. One afternoon, a group of her friends made plans to go to the mall. Stephanie was ready. She was looking forward to it. But she had one condition. Her little sister Joanne had to come along. The friends said no. Stephanie's answer was immediate and without drama. If Joanne doesn't go, I don't go. She stayed home. No argument, no sulking. Just a clear, quiet decision made by a 14-year-old girl who understood something that many adults spend a lifetime trying to learn. That loyalty is not a feeling. It is a choice, and it costs you something or it means nothing at all. By the spring of 1989, Stephanie was finishing out the school year at El Dorado High School in Las Vegas. She had found her place there, the way she always found her place. She sang in the choir, and that classroom had become something sacred to the small group of students who gathered there. Every day at lunch, the same circle of friends made their way to their choir teacher Jocelyn Jensen's room. Not the cafeteria, not the hallways, but Jensen's room because it was theirs. They ate together, talked together, laughed in the same corner every single day. They called themselves the little team, and the name was chosen with the kind of affectionate simplicity that only genuine friendship can produce. 6 weeks from that June morning, Stephanie was supposed to be on a plane to Spain. Her father had new orders. A new country, a new assignment, a new chapter entirely. Everything she had built in Las Vegas, the friendships, the choir, the little team, the familiar path between home and school, was about to be left behind. She never got the chance to say goodbye to any of it. June 1st, 1989, arrived the way Las Vegas summer mornings do, still and already warm before the sun had fully climbed. A quiet that sits heavy on the desert before the heat takes full possession of the day. John Isaacson had worked the overnight shift at Nellis Air Force Base. He came home in the early hours and he went straight to sleep. Stephanie moved through the apartment without a sound. She packed her bag. She pulled on her clothes. She checked the door behind her. She left a sleeping father behind her and stepped out into the morning air. Outside, the desert lay dry and thin in every direction. She turned toward El Dorado High School and began walking the route she had walked dozens of times before, a route she knew as well as she knew her own reflection. At Stewart Avenue and Lynn Lane, she reached the shortcut. A vacant sand lot, open ground, dry brush lining both sides, fine pale sand that shifted quietly underfoot. It was the faster way. She stepped in. The desert was completely silent. She never came out the other side. Her father slept on, unaware. Across the city, her friends were arriving at school, making their way to Jensen's classroom, saving the usual spots, expecting the usual Tuesday. And somewhere in that sand lot, in the dry Nevada heat of a June morning, the worst thing that can happen to a family had already happened. The only question now was how long it would take for the world to find out. El Dorado High School filled up that morning the way schools always do, lockers slamming, sneakers on linoleum, the low ambient noise of 1,000 teenagers navigating another ordinary Tuesday. Stephanie was not among them. The school registered her absence, marked it in their records, and did nothing further. No phone call to her father. No follow-up. They assumed what institutions so often assume: illness, a family matter, something routine and benign. The day moved forward without her. But in Jocelyn Jensen's classroom at lunchtime, something felt profoundly wrong. The little team gathered in their usual corner. Same chairs, same table, same routine that had played out through the school year. Except one seat was empty, Stephanie's seat, and Stephanie was never absent, not like this. Not without a word to anyone, not without some explanation reaching at least one of the people closest to her. Jensen noticed. Her friends noticed. But there was no explanation, just an empty chair that made the room feel different, that turned the ordinary Tuesday afternoon into something unsettled and strange. School ended. Stephanie did not come home. John Isaacson woke up that afternoon the way he always did after a night shift, slowly, the world reassembling itself in stages. He had no reason to be alarmed. Stephanie was responsible. She had been managing her own mornings for months, getting herself up, getting herself to school, handling her own days with the kind of self-sufficiency that her upbringing had given her. Then his girlfriend called. Stephanie had not come home. He told himself it was nothing. She had probably stopped somewhere with friends. Teenagers did that. He waited. The minutes moved. She still did not come home. He called the school. The person on the other end checked the records and told him what they had failed to tell him hours earlier. Stephanie had not been at school. Not for first period. Not for lunch. Not at all. She had never arrived. The bottom fell out of everything. He called her friends one by one. Nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her. Nobody knew where she was. Each call that came back empty was another door closing. He called the police. He filed the report. And then, because John Isaacson was not the kind of man who sat and waited when something could be done, he drove to the stables at Nellis Air Force Base. He called his friend Gary Briley. He called others. Within the hour, a small group of men on horseback moved out into the desert that stretched between Stephanie's apartment and her school. Las Vegas in June. Even after sundown, the heat stays in the ground. The sky was turning dark at the edges, and the desert floor was still warm beneath the horses' hooves. The group moved through the brush at a careful, steady pace, kicking up fine dust that hung in the dry air behind them. They covered the path she would have walked, every shortcut, every gap between buildings, every patch of open ground between Nellis Boulevard and El Dorado High School. They called her name. The desert did not answer. Then Gary Briley slowed his horse. Something on the ground had caught his eye. He looked down. Then he looked at John. "Are those hers?" John Isaacson looked at what was scattered across the sand and felt something move through him that had no name. They were school books spread across the ground in a pattern that no accident produces. Not in a line. Not the careful arrangement of something set down deliberately. They were scattered, thrown, or dropped mid-motion. The way things fall when a person does not get to choose how they fall. And in the sand around them, something else. A trail, not straight, not the path of someone walking purposefully, but a jagged, broken pattern cutting through the dirt and brush. A drag mark, moving away from the open ground and into the thicker vegetation off to the side. Something had happened here, something sudden and violent and fast. John called the police again. His voice was different this time. What followed was the kind of search that tells you, without anyone having to say a word, that everyone involved already understands this is serious. Helicopters swept low over the desert, their beams cutting back and forth across the scrub and sand. 9 units were brought in. Dogs worked the ground in the deepening darkness, noses down, pulling toward every scent that did not belong. Ground teams fanned out on foot, moving in careful lines through the brush. The desert around Stewart Avenue and Nellis Boulevard was largely undeveloped in 1989. Thick patches of dry brush, deep pockets of shadow, the kind of terrain where you could be 20 feet from something and never see it. The search went on through the night. All around them, the city of Las Vegas continued its ordinary business. Lights blazing, music playing, the tireless noise of a place built on the premise that the night never has to end. Out in that desert, flashlight beams swept back and forth through the darkness. No one said what everyone was thinking. Then, just before 11 o'clock that night, one of the K-9 units broke away from the search line. The dog pulled hard to the left, away from the established path, nose pressed to the ground, moving quickly and with absolute certainty toward a dense patch of brush sitting approximately 25 yards off the trail. The handler followed. Officers moved in behind them, and there, half hidden in the brush, was something that should not have been there. An old piece of orange carpet laid over something, covering something. The dog stopped. The desert went completely silent. Every officer standing in that darkness understood in the same instant what they were about to find. They lifted the orange carpet, and then nobody spoke. That is what happens in moments like that. The training, the procedure, the years of experience on the job, all of it goes quiet for just a breath. Because what was underneath that carpet was a 14-year-old girl who had left for school that morning. Stephanie Isaacson. Brown hair, still wearing the clothes she had put on before sunrise. The investigators did what they were trained to do. They documented. They photographed. They moved carefully through that patch of desert brush, bagging evidence, marking positions, working the scene with the kind of focused, precise silence that comes from understanding that this patch of ground is the only witness they have. The autopsy confirmed that Stephanie had been the victim of a sudden and brutal physical assault. The medical examiner determined that she had not survived for long. It was fast, it was violent, and she had been left there, covered with a discarded piece of orange carpet, as though she were something to be hidden away rather than someone to be grieved. The scene was a nightmare for any investigator. The evidence was limited, the terrain was difficult, and the time that had already passed since the assault had worked against them in ways that only experienced detectives fully appreciate. But there was one detail, quiet, cold, and noted carefully, that would stay with investigators long after the initial work was done. Her shoes were gone, not misplaced, not lost in the brush somewhere nearby. Gone. Her shoes were never recovered. Not that day, not in any subsequent search, not in any of the years that followed. A killer who takes something from a victim and keeps it does not do so by accident. That is intentional behavior. That is something chosen. And whatever it meant to the man who had done this, the fact that he had taken Stephanie's shoes said something about who he was, something deliberate, something that spoke to a particular and disturbing psychology. That thought, quiet and cold, would remain in the background of this case for the next 32 years. That same night, John Isaacson went home. The apartment was the same as he had left it that morning. Her things were still there. The life they had built together in that small space still there, unchanged, waiting for a girl who would not come through the door. He picked up the phone, not to call the police, not to call family. He called a radio station. He asked them to play a song. Bette Midler, Wind Beneath My Wings. It was Stephanie's favorite. A father sitting alone in a quiet apartment in the middle of the Las Vegas night, listening to his daughter's song play out over the airwaves. No audience, no ceremony, no witness to the moment, just a man saying goodbye the only way he had left. 2 memorials followed. The first was held in Las Vegas for her friends, for the little team, for the people who had known her and the life she had built in that city. Then her body was taken back to Lincoln, Nebraska, back to the city where she had been born, to be buried at Lincoln Memorial Park, in the ground that had known her family longest. The city of bright lights held its breath for a moment. Then it moved on. That is what cities do. Stephanie did not get to move on. The investigation began with almost nothing and over time became less than that. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the sand lot on the morning of June 1st. But no one could agree on what it had looked like. Color, unknown. Make, unknown. Model, unknown. A car that might have been there described 5 different ways by 5 different people, amounting to exactly nothing that a detective could put to use. People who were known to pass through that undeveloped stretch of desert near Stewart Avenue were followed up on. Those leads went nowhere. 2 months after the murder, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit produced a profile of the likely killer. He was probably in his early 20s. He likely lived or worked close to the crime scene. He was possibly a loner, someone whose behavior had changed noticeably after the attack, who had perhaps been involved in a conflict with a woman in his life in the period shortly before the killing. That profile was more accurate than anyone knew at the time. Every single detail would one day point directly at a man that investigators had never once considered. But in 1989, the profile was paper, and paper does not make an arrest. Detectives worked the case for years. They traveled to Washington State following a lead, then Ohio, then Texas. Each trip was built on something real, a tip, a name, a connection that seemed promising. Each trip ended the same way. Wrong person. Dead end. Back to square one. In 1998, 9 years after the murder, forensic science had advanced to a point where DNA testing on the crime scene evidence seemed worth attempting. The samples were tested. Nothing usable came back. In 2007, they tried again. This time, A cold case team working with more advanced technology was able to identify actual DNA, a forensic sample recovered from Stephanie's shirt. It was real. It was from her killer. They entered it into CODIS, the national DNA database that allows law enforcement agencies across the country to compare genetic profiles, and they waited. No match came. The DNA existed. The killer's genetic fingerprint was sitting in a database. And somewhere out there, the man who had left it on a 14-year-old girl's shirt was living his life, whatever remained of it, completely untouched. The case file stayed open. The years moved forward. Las Vegas grew into a different city around the place where she had died. The sand lot changed. The neighborhood changed. The world moved on, the way the world always does, with the particular indifference it reserves for cases that remain unresolved. Retired Metro Deputy Chief Mike Hawkins, who had worked the original investigation, spoke plainly before he left the department. "What bothers me the most is I know there is someone out there who got away with murder. I think about Stephanie Isaacson." He retired. The case sat. 32 years of silence. 32 years of dust settling over a file that never officially closed but never moved either. Then, in 2021, a man named Justin Wu picked up a phone. He had no badge. He held no jurisdiction over anything. He had never worked a crime scene, never interviewed a witness, never read a detective's case notes. He was an entrepreneur who had moved from Los Angeles to Henderson, Nevada, and somewhere along the way had arrived at the conclusion that living in a place means owing something to it. He had already founded a nonprofit organization called Vegas Helps, not a charity in the distant, abstract sense, not the kind of organization that holds fundraising dinners and issues annual reports, but a direct, hands-on operation. Groceries delivered to families who could not get them any other way. A car for someone who had no other means of transportation to a job. Help that reached people directly, in the form they actually needed. Then Justin Wu heard about a laboratory in Texas that was doing something extraordinary with DNA, something that the scientific community had not seen before. He reached out to Othram Labs. He told them he wanted to fund a cold case. He was prepared to cover the full cost himself, every dollar. But he had one condition. It had to be a Las Vegas case, not a famous case, not a case with significant media attention or public profile, just someone from his city who had been waiting too long for an answer. Othram Labs contacted the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The department looked at their cold case files and made a choice. They brought forward the name of a 14-year-old girl who had been murdered on her way to school 31 years earlier. Stephanie Isaacson. On the other side of that decision stood Detective Terry Miller. She had been assigned to Stephanie's case in 2018, and over the following 3 years had built something that cold case investigators rarely have the time or the resources to develop. A genuine relationship with the victim's family. Every 6 months she called John Isaacson. Not because there was news to report, there was almost never news to report. She called because she needed him to know that someone was still there, that the file had not been forgotten, that his daughter still had someone in her corner, still had a name on her case that belonged to a living, working detective who cared what happened. 3 years of calls. 3 years of the same quiet answer, "We are still working on it." When the Othram opportunity came through, Miller did not hesitate. But she also understood clearly what it meant and what was at stake. The DNA evidence from Stephanie's case had been tested twice, in 1998 and again in 2007. Both times, it had come back with nothing usable. What remained after 3 decades of testing and environmental degradation was almost nothing at all. She said it plainly. "We were at the wall. This was our last shot." In January 2021, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department submitted the last remaining DNA evidence from Stephanie's case to Othram Labs. The quantity they sent was 0.12 nanograms. That number requires some context to fully understand. When you send a DNA sample to a consumer testing service, Ancestry, 23andMe, any of the mainstream genealogy companies, the minimum they require to process your sample is 750 nanograms. That is a standard, everyday, unremarkable amount. That is what a functioning DNA test requires under normal circumstances. What Detective Miller sent to Othram Labs was not 750 nanograms. It was not remotely close to 750 nanograms. The sample she sent was the biological equivalent of 15 human cells. 15 cells. Imagine the last grain of sand at the bottom of an hourglass. Imagine the last drop of water in a glass that has been sitting in the Nevada sun for 30 years. That is what they had. And here is what made this moment so profound and so frightening. It was a single submission. One attempt. If the process failed, if the sample was consumed without producing a usable result, there would be nothing left. No second chance. No future technology to try again with. The evidence would simply cease to exist. 32 years of carefully preserved material gone. That was the weight sitting on this moment. Othram Labs, based outside Houston, Texas, was built specifically for circumstances like this. Their process, forensic-grade genome sequencing, is engineered to extract genetic information from samples that every other available method has already failed on. They do not work with clean, abundant, ideal DNA. They work with what remains when time has taken nearly everything else. What their scientists did with Stephanie's 15 cells was this. They built a genetic profile of her killer. Not a name, not yet. A map. A biological blueprint pointing toward a family somewhere in the population. A starting point for the genealogical work that would follow. Then the genealogists went to work. The genetic profile revealed French-Canadian ancestry, but not from a single place or a single generation. There were roots in French-Canadian communities in New England, and separate, more recent French-Canadian descent from Canada itself. Two different branches, two different timelines crossing somewhere in the family tree of a man that nobody had yet identified. The genealogists built outward from that intersection. They constructed branches, tested connections, eliminated dead ends, returned to earlier nodes and tried again. It is painstaking work that looks nothing like what dramatized versions of it suggest. It is researchers at computers, moving through historical records and family trees, one name and one generation at a time. 7 months of that work. Outside, the world moved through 2021. John Isaacson, now living in South Dakota, waited. Justin Wu, who had been told nothing about which case had been selected or where the investigation stood, waited. Detective Miller waited. The genealogy team narrowed the pool to 2 possible suspects. Then they narrowed it to 1. On July 12, 2021, Othram Labs called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. They had a name. Miller received that call after 3 years of 6-month calls to a grieving father. After 2 prior DNA failures. After an investigation that had traveled through 3 states and come back empty every single time. The name Othram gave her did not arrive from nowhere. It came from a family tree built from 15 cells, from the absolute last evidence that existed in a case that had been cold for 32 years. When the detectives looked at that name, when they pulled up the record attached to it, the room went quiet. Because this man had been suspected of murder before. He had stood in front of the justice system, and he had walked free. His name was Darren Roy Marchand. He was a Las Vegas man. He lived there. He worked there. He walked the same streets, breathed the same desert air, occupied the same city as the families whose lives he destroyed. For 32 years, no one had connected his name to Stephanie Isaacson. He was invisible in plain sight. But his story did not begin with Stephanie. It began 3 years earlier. February 27, 1986. A woman named Nanette Vandenberg was found in her apartment on East Tropicana Avenue. She was 24 years old. She was found in her bathtub. And like Stephanie, she had been the victim of a fatal assault. Investigators traced her last known movements to the Nevada Palace Casino. She had been there that night. She had been there with Darren Marchand, who was 20 years old at the time. When detectives came for him, they found his fingerprints near her body. They had a witness placing him with her in the hours before her death. They charged him with her murder. Then the case fell apart. 2 days of testimony. A judge who ruled the fingerprint evidence insufficient to sustain the charge. The case was dismissed. Darren Marchand walked out of that courtroom a free man. Nanette Vandenberg's family received nothing. Now hold that thought for a moment, because what follows is the part of this story that is almost impossible to sit with comfortably. Less than a year after Nanette Vandenberg's death, Marchand got married. By early 1989, he had a toddler daughter at home and a wife who was pregnant with their son. In January of that same year, 1989, he was charged with 5 counts of predatory and indecent behavior. 5 separate incidents, each involving the targeting of women in public. He pleaded guilty to 1 count. The other 4 were dropped. On August 29, 1989, he was sentenced to a maximum of 1 year of probation. But that sentencing date matters more than it might immediately seem, because Stephanie Isaacson was murdered on June 1, 1989. Darren Marchand killed a 14-year-old girl on her way to school while he was awaiting sentencing for a separate crime. He went home that morning to a pregnant wife and a toddler daughter. He sat in that house through the summer. He waited for his court date. He served his probation. He continued his life. And nobody knew what he had done in that sand lot. Consider for a moment the FBI profile produced in 1989. The killer was likely in his early 20s. He probably lived or worked near the crime scene. He had likely experienced a recent conflict with a woman in his life. His behavior may have changed noticeably in the period after the killing. He may have been something of a loner. Darren Marchand was 24 years old in 1989. He lived minutes from that sand lot. He had an active criminal case involving women at the time of the murder. The FBI drew a perfect outline of him in 1989 and matched it, point by point, in 2021, 32 years apart. Marchand and his wife divorced in 1990. Records indicate he had at least 1 other child from a separate relationship. Whatever his life appeared to be from the outside, whatever ordinary shape it took in the years that followed, inside it, he carried what he had done to Nanette Vandenberg in 1986, and what he had done to Stephanie Isaacson on a warm June morning in 1989. In 1995, a few weeks before his 30th birthday, Darren Roy Marchand died by suicide in Las Vegas. He was 29 years old. Do not call that justice. It was not justice. It was an exit. A door he closed behind himself on his own terms, taking every answer with him, why he did it, whether there were others, what he felt in the years between. John Isaacson never got to sit across from him in a courtroom, never got to watch a verdict come down, never got to look him in the eye. That is what John meant. That son of a bee got me twice. The first time, Marchand took Stephanie. The second time, he took the one thing that might have offered even a fraction of closure, accountability, reckoning, a moment where the truth had real and public consequences. He denied them both. On July 21, 2021, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department held a press conference. 32 years after a 14-year-old girl stepped into a sand lot and never came out, they had a name. Lieutenant Ray Spencer stood at that podium and read a statement from Stephanie's mother, Sharon. "I'm glad they found who murdered my daughter. I never believed the case would be solved. It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us." Every word of that statement deserves to be read slowly. The relief, the grief, the unsolvable arithmetic of a loss that can be explained but never repaired. A mother who had lived for 32 years without knowing who had taken her daughter, now knowing the name of a man who was already dead, who had already slipped beyond the reach of anything the law could do. Detective Dan Long, who had worked the case alongside Terry Miller, said what every investigator on this case felt about the man responsible. "I'd like to think he committed suicide because of the things he was doing." And Othram CEO David Middleman made a statement that reached well beyond this single case. "Eventually, this technology will drive repeat crime to extinction." 15 cells, a world record at the time for the smallest DNA sample ever used to solve a homicide. 32 years, one name. On September 21, 2021, John Isaacson stood inside the Clark County Commission chambers in Las Vegas. Across from him was Justin Wu, the man who had written a check for $5,000 and asked only that it help someone from his city who had been waiting too long. The two men shook hands. No words recorded from that moment have survived in the public record, but the photograph exists. A father, a stranger who cared enough to act. And between them, the invisible weight of everything that had finally, after 3 decades, been put to rest. Not in the way John had needed it to be, not with a verdict and a reckoning and a moment of public truth, but in the only way that remained available, with a name, with certainty, with the knowledge that the world now knew who had done this, even if the world could not hold him accountable. In 2024, Justin Wu received the key to the Las Vegas Strip, one of the highest civic honors that Clark County can bestow, for the work his Vegas Justice League had done in pursuing cold cases across southern Nevada. Stephanie's case was where it all began. She was the first name he had asked to help. She was the reason the work started. She was 14 years old, 6 weeks from Spain. She was the girl who stayed home from the mall because her little sister couldn't come along, who made that decision without drama or resentment, who understood at 14 what loyalty actually required. She was the voice in the choir, the center of the little team, the daughter who chose her father when the world asked her to choose, the young woman who went underwater at Lake Mead beside her dad and earned a certification and came back up laughing. She walked into a sand lot on a warm June morning in 1989, and the desert took her. But it could not keep her forever. 15 cells. That is what remained of 32 years of evidence, the biological residue of a single moment of violence, preserved through decades of testing and degradation until there was almost nothing left. 15 cells carried 32 years of silence. And when the right people finally listened, when the science finally caught up to what had been done to her, those 15 cells said her name loud enough for the whole world to hear. Stephanie Isaacson. She was never just a case file. She was never just a cold case number in a department drawer. She was a girl who loved horses and motorcycles and scuba diving and her little sister and her father and the choir room where her friends gathered every day at lunch. She was a girl who was 6 weeks from a plane to Spain and a whole new chapter of her life. She never got that chapter, but she got this much at least, the truth. Her name attached to it, the world knowing what happened to her, and who was responsible, and that someone cared enough. A detective who called every 6 months even when there was nothing to report. An entrepreneur who wrote a check and made one phone call. A laboratory that worked for 7 months on 15 cells to make sure she was not forgotten. That is not justice. It was never going to be justice. Justice would have required Darren Marchand to stand in a courtroom, to face the families he had destroyed, to hear a verdict read aloud. Justice would have given John Isaacson the moment he needed to look the man in the eye. Justice would have arrived while Stephanie was still young enough for the world to offer her something in return for what it had taken. None of that happened. None of that was possible. But this happened. Her name is known. The truth is recorded. And Stephanie Isaacson, the girl who never missed a lunch in Jensen's classroom, who never broke a promise to her sister, who went beneath the surface of Lake Mead and came back up into the sunlight beside her father, is remembered. She was never just a case file, and she never will be. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to consider what it means. This family carried this weight for 32 years. The least any of us can do is make sure her name is remembered. 3 questions worth sitting with. If Darren Marchand had been convicted in 1986 for the murder of Nanette Vandenberg, Stephanie Isaacson would almost certainly be alive today. What responsibility, if any, does the justice system bear for what followed? Justin Wu was an ordinary private citizen with no law enforcement background, just a man who decided to act. How many cold cases do you believe are sitting right now, waiting for someone like him to step forward? Stephanie's DNA evidence was 15 cells away from disappearing permanently. How many cases, do you think, have already gone cold forever simply because no one moved quickly enough?